Hi, Stats class. I'm Steven.
I'm Noelani.
I'm Ashley.
And I'm Peter.
And we're the Avengers.
Did you know logic is a systematic method for getting the wrong conclusion with confidence, and statistics is a systematic method for getting the wrong conclusion with 95% confidence?
The question our group came up with is, does your financial aid such as Pell, tribal, and academic scholarships exceed your educational expenses?
And the reason we chose this question is because our class was talking a lot about fee increases and possible fee increases for the university within the next 2 years. So we wanted to see how many students could actually afford to still stay here if fees do increase. So for our data collection, we did the community-based participatory research approach. So we did randomized sampling of the students. We got a total of 290 surveys out of 900 students here at Haskell, and 124 of those surveys were yeses and 166 of those surveys were no. And then we had 6 outliers.
Now we're going to conduct a hypothesis test to test our claim that for the majority of students, the financial aid that they receive is greater than their education expenses. And to do that, we're going to conduct a hypothesis test. So for step 1, our claim is going to be that P is greater than 0.5, P being a majority of students that receive more than their education expenses require. That's step 1. Step 2, the symbolic form that must be true if the original claim is false. In this case, P has to be less than or equal to 0.5. Step 3, then we give the symbolic expression for alternative hypothesis H1. And HO. HO is P equals 0.5 for H1. P is greater than 0.5. Step 4, select the significance level. And for our uses, it's going to be 0.05. Step 5, identify the statistic that is relevant to this test. So for ours, we're going to use normal z-test stat. Step 6, we're going to do the test statistic with critical values and finding the critical region. For our test statistic, z equals 0.73 minus 0.5 divided by the square root of p, which is 0.5, times 1 minus 0.5 divided by n, which is 290. And our test statistic is going to equal 0.03. For our critical value, we're going to use the given value that we received in class for the majority of our test statistics, which is 1.645. Next is the critical region. And with our critical value, that establishes our reject region and our fail to reject region. And with our test statistic, we have 0.03. As you can see, with our test statistic being 0.03, it falls in the fail to reject region. Given our graph, that dictates that for step 7, we reject the HO hypothesis. And for that, for step 8, what that essentially means is there's not sufficient sample evidence to support the claim that the majority of your students receive financial aid that exceeds their education expenses.
Now we're going to calculate our margin of error, which is our mean plus or minus 1 standard deviation for a confidence level of 95%. We're going to use this equation here. And this is going to be times our z-chart value of 1.96, where P is our sample proportion and Q is 1 minus our sample proportion. So our sample proportion is our number of yeses, which in this case is 124, divided by the total number of surveys, which is the numbers of yeses, 124, plus the no's, which is 166. Our sample proportion in this instance is 0.43. The Q value equals 1 minus our sample proportion. This gives us a Q value of 0.572. Altogether, it looks like this. The result is 0.137. And we take our mean value and we add plus or minus the value we just calculated. So our confidence interval went from 0.29 on the low side to 0.57 on the high side. Our actual results were 0.42. So we fell well within the range of our margin of error. Our confidence interval, based on the statistics that we gathered, was that on our low end, 30% of the students do have financial assistance to cover their educational expenses. On the high end, 57% of the students will have the ability to cover their expenses. The actual proportion that we calculated fell within our margin of acceptability at 42%.
And based on those calculations, initially it disputes our claim that the majority of students has financial aid that meets or exceeds their financial aid. When conducting our hypothesis test, and when we graphed it, what we ended up doing was we ended up rejecting the HO hypothesis, and based on the graph, it states that there's not sufficient sample evidence to support our claim that the majority of students receive financial aid that meets or exceeds their academic expenses.
Our original question was, does your financial aid, Pell, tribal, and academic scholarships exceed your educational expenses? We did have a few questions that had both yes and no circled, so some of the things we could have done differently to get better answers. We could have defined what educational expenses are. We should have put in parentheses like the $215 that is required here at Haskell plus books. And then also, we had a few comments on some of our surveys saying not everyone receives Pell, but we could have also wrote and or tribal and academic scholarships, because the majority of students who don't receive Pell receive some kind of tribal aid or American Indian College Fund.
Thanks for watching. And now I'll take any questions that you have.
Bye-bye!